American History, Chapter 3, Global Changes Reshape Colonial America. Now, after Charles II took the throne, both Connecticut and Rhode Island were granted charters that allowed them to maintain local autonomy. Charles II used other colonies to repay his debts to his supporters by granting them land in North America and giving them positions on the councils for trade and plantations and partnerships in the Royal African Company. Charles' brother James, the Duke of York, was given control of New York. William Penn Jr. established Pennsylvania as a refuge for his fellow Quakers. Between 1660 and 1685, English aristocrats established proprietary colonies from Carolina to New York. Most proprietors sought to create a highly structured society that was based on the English manorial system. In Northern Carolina, less affluent settlers forced the proprietors to lower the land prices and guarantee some governmental rights. Remember, in 1660 and 1664, Virginia and Maryland, respectively, codified the term chattel into their state founding and legal documents. And that word means movable property, and it specifically references African slaves. English West Indian planters tried to recreate Barbados in southern Carolina by importing African slaves, creating large plantations, and establishing a trade relationship with the West Indies. Now, Northern Carolina does have a few large plantations, but for the most part, the earliest settlers and inhabitants of Northern Carolina were primarily working people and poor people. Many of the folks in Southern Carolina were wealthier. The exception, of course, being that there were wealthy planters on the coast of Northern Carolina. Pennsylvania's early government guaranteed religious freedom for Christians and allowed all land-owning men to vote and hold office. William Penn also established good relations with the local Indians and attracted thousands of settlers. Now, not all of these earliest colonies allowed everyone to vote. Some only allowed the wealthiest to vote, those with significant property holdings. But all land-owning men in Pennsylvania were allowed to vote. James II succeeded Charles to the throne and was much more authoritarian than his brother. James consolidated the northeastern colonies, banned town meetings, and challenged original colonial charters, and began to impose new taxes. James was overthrown in 1688 in the Glorious Revolution. William of Orange and his wife Mary, the Protestant daughter of James II, became joint rulers and introduced more democracy. John Locke wrote in support of the changes, challenging and arguing that the government depended on the consent of the governed. In 1692, William and Mary granted a charter for the new colony of Massachusetts, in which Plymouth and Maine were joined with Massachusetts Bay. While the charter restored town meetings and an elected assembly, and expanded voting and office holding rights to all property owners, not just Puritans. It gave the Crown the right to appoint a royal governor and customs officials. Maryland was also assigned a royal governor, and the Church of England became the established religion there. In New York, the new royal governor created a representative assembly and supported a board of aldermen that was dominated by wealthy English merchants. William and Mary asserted royal authority, but tried to create a partnership with the colonial elites and the crown by supporting long-standing local institutions. With the founding of Georgia in 1732, England had 13 North American colonies, a number that would be maintained until the start of the Revolution. Now, what we see with William and Mary is an attempt to maintain influence and, to a lesser extent, control over the colonies, but a desire to encourage the colonies to grow and become successful. Now, the Crown certainly wanted to be able to ensure that people followed English law and, of course, paid their taxes. James II modeled himself after French King Louis IV, but both rulers believed in the divine right of kings. Louis was more successful in maintaining his authority. France extended its empire more through trade and exploration than through settlement. In 1682, René Robert Calvert and La Salle traveled down the Mississippi River into the Gulf of Mexico, and they claimed the territory of Louisiana for France, but they failed to establish an actual colony. Now, the English really come into North America, into this new world, and decide that they want to build colonies and they want to establish towns and they really want to stay in North America. But the French sort of take a different approach, and they want to be able to trade and they want to be able to extract wealth, but they don't necessarily intend to live and create new settlements in North America. They are primarily focused on exploring and trade. Seeking a southern outlet for furs, the French settlers established settlements along Louisiana's Gulf Coast. Several forts were established in Biloxi and Mobile Bay. A small outpost survived in spite of internal and external conflict, epidemics, and minimal support from France on the other side of the ocean. By 1715, Louisiana tallied only 300 French settlers. Now, Spain had a slightly varying approach as well. Spain tended to explore and attempted to extract a lot of wealth from North America and, of course, to convert the natives to Spanish religion. Spain's authority was dangerously thin in the northern provinces. Tensions worsened between the Spanish and the Pueblos in New Mexico, as drought and disease prompted the Pueblo to reject Catholicism and return to their native traditions. In response to this, the Spanish officials hanged 3 Indian leaders and punished numerous others, among them Pope. Pope led 17,000 Pueblo Indians in a broad-based revolt that began on August 10, 1680. In coordinated attacks, they attacked forts, destroyed farms, desecrated churches, and drove the Spanish out of New Mexico. But the Spanish were able to reconquer parts of New Mexico in 1690 because of the Apache raids and internal conflicts among the Pueblo. By 1696, the Spanish had regained control of the province. To prevent another revolt from occurring, Franciscan missionaries established better relationships with the Pueblo by allowing them to retain native practices. The Pueblo Revolt limited Spanish expansion by strengthening other American Indian groups who were encouraged by the early successes of the Pueblo. Pueblo refugees taught the Navajo to grow corn, raise sheep, and ride horses. The Navajo passed that knowledge to the Utes and the Comanches. The Comanches built a vast trading and hunting network based on the availability of horses. In New Mexico, where Spanish control was weak in Taos, the Comanche sold slaves and traded horses and weapons. Spain sought to solidify its presence in Texas to counteract the French claims to Louisiana. In the early 18th century, missions and forts appeared along the present-day Louisiana border. Because the Apache and other native groups were very powerful Indian nations, Texas's Spanish residents adopted many of the native practice and customs in order to avoid conflict. So we see a lot of adaptation and a lot of sharing in ideas among the natives so that they can survive, and we see a lot of adaptation from the earliest settlers in the area. In Florida, Indians worked to undermine the spread of cattle ranching. English traders encouraged Indian trade, and some groups moved north. Anglo-Spanish tensions along the border eventually exploded into war. Louis IV of France wanted supremacy in Europe and built a very large and professional army. The French army came to seem invincible after securing victories over its nearest neighbors. King William's War, which was fought between 1689 and 1697, was the first sustained war waged by France and England in North America. Conflict in Europe spread to North America when attacks on French and Huron settlements around Montreal and northern New York. Although the war ended in a virtual draw, many colonists who served in the English army died of wounds, disease, and starvation. Those who survived resented what they thought was an unnecessary loss of life. The Indian fur trade was devastated, and in 1701 the Iroquois agreed to remain neutral in all future European conflicts. In the War of Spanish Succession, which lasted from 1702 to 1713, also known as Queen Anne's War, England fought against both France and Spain, each of which hoped for additional territory in North America. The treaty that ended the war was intended to establish long-term peace, but England truly gained the most. Having incorporating Scotland into Great Britain in 1707's Act of Union, England claimed Newfoundland, Nova Scotia, and the Hudson Bay Territory from France. It also gained St. Kitts, Gibraltar, and Minorca from Spain. England also obtained the right to sell slaves in Spain's North American colonies. Rather than creating a lasting peace, the Treaty of Utrecht led to all three European nations strengthening fortifications along their colonial borders. Native peoples struggled to remain autonomous. Some allied with Europeans to improve their trading position, but the threat of colonial expansion empowered male warriors in societies in which older women had traditionally held significant power. Conflicts began to divide Indian groups along generational and gender lines. In the late 17th century, guns began increasing tensions between Indian tribes. Slaves became the most valuable commodity for Indians to trade, especially in the southern region, increasing the conflict between the tribes. Some southern tribes tried to create a pan-Indian alliance, similar to that formed in the 1670s by the Indians in New England. A group of Tuscaroras attacked North Carolina settlers in 1711, with the hope that other local tribes would join in. Instead, South Carolina rallied the support of the Yamasees and other tribes and defeated the Tuscaroras by 1713. The Tuscaroras forfeited their land in the South and moved north, becoming part of the Iroquois Confederacy. The Yamasee War erupted shortly thereafter in 1715, as the Yamasee people, deeply in debt to the British, allied with the Creeks and the Cherokees in the most serious Indian war in the colonies. Only after the Cherokees changed their allegiance were the British able to secure victory and impose a very fragile peace. The Yamasee War transformed North America. The Creek and the Catawba tribes built independent confederations, but the Cherokees had allied with the British, and the Creek and the Caddo tribes sided with the French. Despite the British victory, colonists in the back country of the southern, middle Atlantic, and New England colonies suffered periodic raids and met fierce resistance as they moved west. Likewise, Native Americans who were displaced from their traditional lands came into conflict with those tribes further west. All of this conflict only helped to fuel the growth of the Indian slave trade on the western frontier as the French and Spanish continued to compete for dominance. Now, here we see a map of the European Empire in North America, and this is from 1715 to about 1750. And we can see that this coastal area here is primarily all under British control. And we see that this area up here in Canada and around in places near Illinois, all of these areas here are under the French control. And then we see that the Spanish have Florida and little snippets of territory over here. But we have a lot of natives who are right here in these areas, different native groups. And they really recognize that if the British continue coming in along this territory, it's going to push these natives into the French territories over here. And so they really begin to resist any further encroachment. By 1720, many British colonists were convinced that British proprietors cared little about the colony's welfare, given the British Army's treatment of colonial militias and Parliament's unwillingness to help in stopping Indian attacks. A growing number of new immigrants to the colonies were not from Britain and thus were not reflexively loyal to British authority. In 1732, Georgia was established as a buffer between South Carolina's profitable plantations and Spanish Florida. Spanish authorities were furious, and in 1739 they captured an English ship captain who was trading illegally in the West Indies and severed his ear. British forces attacked St. Augustine. The invasion of Georgia by the Spanish troops in 1742 also failed. Once again, an American conflict had become part of a broader European war in which the Spanish, the French, allied against the British and the Germans. The war ended in 1748 with British supremacy over Georgia, but at very great cost. Many colonists wondered if British and American interests were even compatible. Southern Indians were also embroiled in these ongoing disputes, particularly in lower Mississippi and Texas. The French had trade relationships with the Caddo and the Choctaw, and the Spanish had overcome a bitter history and agreed to stop kidnapping and enslaving Apache women and children in order to achieve a very powerful alliance. The British needed support from the German, Scots-Irish, Swiss, and Protestant French immigrants to secure the frontier. Germans and the Scots settled in the backcountry of Virginia, the Carolinas, and Georgia at the middle of the century. Other immigrants settled along the inland waterways of South Carolina. European consumers shaped the kinds of goods that were available to the rest of the world, and African slaves as commodities and as producers of other commodities enabled Britain to participate fully in the global market. The global trade increased and diversified in the early 18th century. Goods were flowing not only between Europe, Africa, Asia, and the colonies, but also amongst the colonies themselves. New Englanders supplied fish to the Caribbean and the Carolinas, and rum, molasses, slaves, and ship stores flowed back. The growth of coffee houses in port cities in North America was crucial to expanding credit and trade as merchants and sea captains exchanged information. Newspapers in Britain and in America contain news of stock prices, politics, and economic disasters such as the South Seas bubble. In the late 17th century, Mercantilism became the favored economic system in England and in France. Mercantilism centered on establishing a favorable balance of trade by exporting more than importing, or selling more than buying. France's finance minister taxed foreign imports to encourage trade between France's colonies, which produced raw materials, and the home country, which used those materials to manufacture goods for sale. England benefited more fully from mercantilism because England had access to a greater supply of natural resources and larger markets for its goods. The Navigation Act enhanced the mercantile system by enacting controls on colonial trade. For example, certain enumerated articles could only be exported to England, and certain imported items had to be carried on English ships or on ships with mostly English crews. In 1663, Parliament required that all goods going into the colonies from Europe had to stop in England. Starting in 1673, England sent customs officials to America and to English ports as goods flourished from those areas. Parliament tried to protect Britain's domestic manufacturing by forbidding the colonies from manufacturing textiles, hats, iron goods, and other goods, and even tried to regulate the trade between the colonies. By 1750, 75% of manufacturing trade between Great Britain and North America and 95% of trade with the West Indies was controlled by North American merchants. Although mercantilism was expected to benefit Great Britain, it created a mercantile elite in the colonies. Now, here on this map, you can see the North Atlantic trade, and you can see the various major ocean trade routes in green, as well as the major centers of trade. And remember from the earlier map, this area here is largely completely controlled by the English. So this area here is really indicative of the amount of power that those in the colonies, these elites in the colonies, truly had at this particular time. The Royal African Company was chartered in 1672 as England came to take on greater roles in the African slave trade. 40% of all slaves sold in the Americas between 1700 and 1808 were carried on British and colonial ships. Although many captive Africans died in transit or in Africa itself, Africans brought to America transformed the labor in the colonies and became an important element of international trade, and made fortunes of their own. African merchants and European traders built the slave trade, trading slaves for commodities such as guns and metalware. At the beginning of the slave trade, most slaves were prisoners of war, but as trade grew, more and more men, women, and children were captured purely for the transatlantic trade. Over time, the trade moved further inland, devastating West Africa, particularly the Congo-Angola region. The Middle Passage across the Atlantic was a horrific and often deadly experience for Africans. Slaves were chained below the decks with insufficient food and water. Women were often the victims of rape. Moreover, the slaves spoke different languages, so none of them knew exactly where they were going or what would happen to them. Surviving slaves went through a seasoning process, a period of acculturation in the West Indies. Many slaves did not survive, falling victim to disease or even suicide. Others adapted even as they worked to resist enslavement. The slave trade turned the colonial seaports into metropolitan centers, whose inhabitants spent lavishly on homes and consumer goods throughout the cities. Although many of those cities contained less than 10% of the colonial population, they were centers of commercial, political, and cultural activity. Because wealth could be made easily in North America, concepts of status changed in the 18th century. Status was increasingly tied more to economic success and a genteel lifestyle than family pedigree. Benjamin Franklin was an example of social mobility in the 18th century. After years as an apprentice for his brother's paper, the New England Courant, Franklin eventually landed in Philadelphia, and in 1729 he became the printer of the Pennsylvania Gazette. Colonial elites delighted in conspicuous consumption and built large homes emulating those of the British gentry. They also supported public buildings, public infrastructure projects, and development that would enhance trade and leisure. The success of international trade created deep class divisions. In addition to merchants, artisans, and small shopkeepers, colonial cities contained a growing number of unskilled laborers, unemployed, and enslaved. The frequent wars contributed to those divisions, increasing the profits of merchants and the upper classes. In contrast, the aftermath of these conflicts brought rising prices, falling wages, and a lack of employment for the lower classes. Now, we're going to look at the slave trade and the destination of slaves more closely. If we look at this chart, we can see the rise and ultimately the decline of slaves being brought into North America. Now, you can see that the uptick really begins during the colonial years in 1651. Remember, this is just a few years before Virginia and Maryland begin to codify slavery as something that is specific to African slaves and separate from indentured servitude. An increase in the slave trade during the colonial years of the 16th century, slaves really began to transform the mainland of America. But the vast majority of slaves are actually sent to the West Indies and to Brazil. If we look here, we can see that less than 10% of Africans were transported to North America. We have 3.6% that are transported into mainland North America, and about 4.6% into Spanish North America. So that's going to be those lower parts of Florida. But what's interesting is that Brazil has 45% of slaves that are being transported, and the Caribbean about 45% as well. The majority of slaves are brought to Brazil and the West Indies. More than 90% of slaves being transported are being transported by the Spanish. Here we see a blueprint of a slave ship, and we can see the lower decks here that are literally next to one another in very, very, very close and cramped quarters. We know that the slaves are chained to the ship. We know that they are not able to get up and move around when they choose. We know that they are not given adequate food and water. And we can also make some conclusions that they're not able to relieve themselves when they need to use the restroom. Now, in addition to slaves in the colonies, there are other people who perform labor. There are many unemployed laborers in the area that did not necessarily find jobs, even though there was an increase in demand for labor. This is because many employers preferred indentured servants, apprentices, or slaves. Laborers had to match their skills with the skills that were in demand. Indentured servants work much longer at a lower rate than a free person, a free laborer. Workers such as William Morley found themselves at the mercy of economic forces when they completed their indentured contracts. Slavery began to replace indentured servitude throughout the South and in many parts of the North. Other laborers competed for a shrinking pool of positions as master craftsmen took on fewer and fewer apprentices in order to maintain the value of their trade. The redemptioner became the new form of bound labor in North America. Shipping agents would offer would-be immigrants passage to the colonies on the condition that the passengers would find an employer who would repay the cost of the passage. This system was particularly popular among German immigrants who hoped to become independent farmers in Pennsylvania. Hundreds of convicts came to America each year and were indentured to American employers. As late as 1750, the majority of white workers were bound servants. Slaves were a small percentage of the total northern population, except New York, where white workers competed with slaves for jobs as dock workers, seamen, blacksmiths, and household servants. While white bound laborers may have felt some commonality with slaves, they knew that eventually they would be free. Many immigrants hoped to become landowners or independent business owners. Former indentured servants had to compete with bound laborers and other free laborers for jobs. There were land shortages in many areas, and even well-established landowners saw their economic prospects begin to decline. As the colonial population grew in the 18th century, more people competed for land and jobs. Many jobless laborers migrated from town to town, looking for work and doing whatever odd jobs they could find. Seasonal work created an entire population of transient workers. To ensure that these workers did not become public charges, the communities adopted a warning out system. Poverty was a growing problem in 18th century cities. Some towns provided relief to residents in the form of food and clothing. Many towns appointed overseers of the poor. By 1750, every seaport had an almshouse or a workhouse designed to teach the poor proper work habits by having them earn their room and board. Efforts at relief, however, generally fell short. Now, this chart shows us the slave population in the Americas. In particular, we can see that there is a pretty steep incline in slave population in the British West Indies. We can also see that the numbers are significantly lower through about 1680 in the southern and northern colonies. Now we do see an uptick begin in about 1680 in the southern colonies and continue on the incline. Although the numbers stay relatively low in the northern colonies, it's important to understand that slavery does exist in all parts of North and South America. The majority of colonists lived in rural areas, where the family remained the central unit of economic activity. Farm families participated in commercial networks by selling farm produce of all kinds in order to buy sugar, tea, and other imported items. Communities that had once been largely rural became commercial centers in the 18th century. A sharp increase in population left many farm families unable to provide land for their own children. As a result, increased migration to the frontier began to occur. While most former indentured servants in the 17th century had become landowners, by the 18th century, only 2 of every 10 former indentured servants was likely to secure land. The population of the Middle Atlantic colonies grew to 250,000 by 1750. Wheat prices had skyrocketed in Europe, and thousands of new European immigrants hoping to take advantage of the boon flooded to Pennsylvania, New York, and the backcountry of Virginia. The Germans and Scots-Irish created self-contained communities throughout the Middle Atlantic. Immigrants could acquire land more readily in the South, but their economic prospects were increasingly limited by slavery. The planter merchant elite who benefited from the controlled slave labor also controlled all elements of economic and political life, making less elite families dependent upon the planters and the merchants for military protection. Now, this is an important thing that's taking place. The plantation owners, the very wealthy in the South, not only do they control the primary means by which labor is achieved, and that is, of course, through slave labor, they also control economic life and political life. So for those in the area who were not elites, it was very difficult to obtain any kind of separate income, any kind of political power, and to even find a job in many cases. The use of slaves gradually grew more prevalent in the Chesapeake after 1676. But the Carolinas developed as a slave society from the beginning. Dependence on slave labor made possible the production of large-scale, labor-intensive cash crops, enriching the merchants and the planters. But Southern elites were also more dependent on the global economy. As a result, the prospects of non-slaveholding whites and free blacks were very, very limited. Beginning in the 1660s, the assemblies in Virginia and Maryland had rigorously defined slavery. Recall, they used the word chattel to mean movable property, and this further restricted the movement and behavior of slaves. Masters were allowed to kill disobedient slaves without any punishment. Slaves were prohibited from carrying a weapon, and conversion to Christianity was removed as a reason that a slave could be granted manumission or their freedom. As slavery grew due to the increasing number of African slaves imported by the Royal African Company, the number of free blacks continued to decline. Only 5% of the 150,000 blacks in the Chesapeake in 1750 were free. But it is important to note that there are some free blacks or former slaves who were originally brought to the Americas as indentured laborers who earned their freedom. More men were imported than women, further skewing the sexual ratio that was beginning to produce some semblance of family life and slowing the production of children. These brutal conditions sparked slave resistance, causing fearful whites to impose stricter regulations. The regulations further separated the enslaved blacks from the indentured servants who were white. Because many settlers came from Barbados, the practices of the British West Indies shaped the slave society that developed in the Carolinas. Although slaves initially used to help with the livestock, their skills in rice cultivation made them much more valuable to plantation owners who recognized the potential of rice as a major export crop. Now, on this map, again, recall this area is primarily under English influence, but we do see that there are predominant ethnic groups in certain areas along this coastline. Of course, those who trace their lineage to English or Welsh are the largest percentages, but we do see huge sections of German immigrants, chunks here of Scots Irish, and other ethnic groups along the way. So we do see that even as slavery is becoming more codified and written into the law in the colonies are an increasingly diverse area. Slaves resisted their enslavement in a variety of mostly nonviolent ways, such as feigning illness or refusing to work. Some, however, engaged in violent revolts. The punishment for slave revolts ranged from whipping and mutilation to execution. As whites became more paranoid about revolts, they became less concerned about whether the slaves being punished were actually guilty. Both Southern and Northern whites understood that slaves wanted freedom, and as more slaves came directly from Africa, rebellions, both real and imagined, increased. In 1712, a slave revolt in New York resulted in the deaths of 8 whites and the subsequent execution of 18 slave insurgents. In 1741, suspicious fires in New York City and fears of an alliance among blacks and working-class whites led authorities to execute 34 people, including 4 whites. 72 blacks were banished from the city. The most serious slave revolt of the colonial era occurred in South Carolina in 1739. After stealing weapons from a store and killing the store's owner, a group of slaves marched south along the Stono River, killing whites and encouraging other slaves to join them. The rebels were eventually surrounded, and many of them died in the ensuing battle or were captured and executed shortly thereafter. The Stono Rebellion occurred against the backdrop of increasing tensions between Spanish Florida and the English colonies and a high importation of African slaves. Spanish authorities promised freedom to escaped slaves and in 1738 formed a black militia company. The outbreak of war in 1739 may have further encouraged the Stono Rebellion. Here we see an image of a indigo farm or laborers for indigo. And a couple of things to think about here is that we can see that only slaves carrying the indigo seem to be doing the heavy labor. We see here that these are the people that are doing the bulk of the work, while we have these folks here who are not doing heavy labor. The other thing that we can see is that this indigo is a process by which it has to be cultivated. So we can see here moving in through and extracting here. So this is a bit of a complicated process. But images tell us something important. And so this image also sort of shows that the enslavements of African Americans and the forced labor wasn't necessarily cruel. And the hope, of course, is that it will encourage others to come to this area and purchase slaves and begin to cultivate indigo. Now, this is not necessarily indicative of the harshness of the labor or the massive numbers of slaves that would have been present on an indigo plantation. This brings us to the end of chapter 3.